What's up, guys, and welcome to episode 3 of the Sketchwave. Myself, JoelCreate, and of course my co-host, the one and only James Julier. James, how you doing?
Very good, thanks, man. Yeah, good day. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. I'm good. I've been recklessly trying to solve the problem of why my camera was so fuzzy in the last episode. So hopefully that's been fixed, and we're trying to iron out a few little sort of things in the early episodes, which you're all along for the journey with, nice and live, of course.
Yeah.
So,
Same with my microphone. I've been kind of cheaping it out in my tutorials and editing the sound in post-production. But I'm going to invest in a decent microphone. I've finally been dragged into the year 2024. So I've got one on order. So from now on, we'll have a decent microphone in addition to hopefully decent picture. So
Does that mean I get over 470,000 thank yous from every subscriber you
possibly,
can send my way?
yeah.
So talking about another thing that you invested in the first episode, we spoke about your new purchase of an iPad.
Mhm.
I believe the postman has been around to your house this morning.
Absolutely, and I'm using the iPad now, and that's one of the reasons why I'm actually look like I'm looking vaguely at the center of the camera now, as opposed to the previous 2 episodes. So yeah, I've not really had a lot of chance to play with it very much. It took me ages just to sort of sync it up with iCloud and get everything ported across, which is a bit of a frustration, but we've got there. I've had a little go at the Apple Pencil and the trackpad because I've got the Magic Keyboard, and it's very nice. You know, it's a little early days. I do like the Apple Pencil Pro. It looks exactly the same, other than the text, to the previous Apple Pencil 2, except it does have a little clicky thing. So when you squeeze it, you get a little haptic response, and it for all the world, it feels like you're actually pressing the plastic, and it's got a little hinge or something. You know, it does feel genuinely like it has a moving part that it doesn't. And same with the trackpad on the Magic Keyboard. I did test it without it being on, and it does feel different, but it does have a little bit of give on the trackpad on the Magic Keyboard. But then, in addition to that, has a little haptic response as well when it's on. That's really nice. You know, and that's about as far as I can say now. I did notice a really strange addition. I don't know whether this was already on the M2 iPad version of Notes, but I opened the Notes just to test the Apple Pencil because Procreate is still syncing. I've got so many files in Procreate; it's taking an absolute age just to port those across. But I had to go in the Notes application, and it's a really kind of strange synthetic shadow that it casts. So it's very odd. You know, you're using like a fine liner, and it creates a little artificial shadow of the fine liner as you move the pencil around, and it moves completely in sync with the Apple Pencil. It's really subtle. I thought it was a real shadow at first, but it wasn't. It was a generated shadow within the Notes app. But it was kind of cool. I don't know whether this is something that has existed on other updated versions of that Notes app, but it did strike me as just something really quite unusual.
So that's not the hover feature then, like it being in play there. That's potentially a new feature.
I don't know. Maybe it has been in place since the hover feature, and maybe, you know, if anyone has used the Notes app and noticed that shadow being cast from the Apple Pencil quite recently, could leave that in the comment section. But I've never seen it before. My iPad was the M1, so I don't know. Maybe we're just, you know, out of touch with those little tweaks. As to whether you get little things like that within Procreate, that might be quite nice, but I don't know whether they're going to invest in little changes like that. It's more of an Apple thing to do, I suspect.
I think in the event they did mention some sort of clicking as you're making your way across the layers. So as you're sort of moving,
right,
because you can use the Apple Pencil Pro to highlight layers.
Yes.
With the squeeze function. And as you squeeze and hold, as you sort of hover over a layer, it will kind of highlight it, but with a click at the same time. So you should then get some feedback. Their haptics are some of the most amazing things, because when I look at my MacBook and the trackpad, I'm convinced it moves. I'm convinced it goes up and down, but it doesn't. And the only time you ever know that it genuinely is just a slate of sort of glass or whatever sort of material it is when your Mac freezes. If I push my Mac and it freezes, and I'm trying to use it and I'm trying to click, it won't click anymore because the whole system's froze, and now my trackpad won't click anymore. So yeah, I can. When you say, and I've seen a couple of reviews about it already, the pencil, when you click it, in sort of where the double tap zone was before, you feel as if you are doing something, like there's some sort of action there, but it's simply synthetic and it's made by the haptics in the pencil.
It's clever. It's clever. And it makes me think, well, what we discussed on the previous episode, if they were to invest some time in using that haptic engine to give the feel of an actual texture when you're drawing on the surface, if they were to somehow try and implement that, I think they could do that really well. So yeah, fingers crossed that they look into that. That's definitely something that I think would make the addition of the haptic engine something worth having rather than just, the current things are arguably worth having, but I would actually prefer the feel of a real texture, because even with the paper-like screen protectors or the other brand ones I've tried, that feeling of it being paper textured isn't very convincing. It doesn't last for very long. Yeah, a little bit of texture at first, but as soon as you've been using it for a little while, the areas that you've been going over kind of wear down, and that texture disappears pretty quick.
Yeah.
And it's always been very minimal anyway, so if they're able to summon up that feeling of texture somehow with
you say about the feeling, what was the feeling like of holding the iPad and how thin it is?
It's noticeably thinner. It is noticeably thinner. I think I bought into the hype a little bit too much. You read or watch all these reviews and people saying it's like, just defies the laws of physics almost, but it's not quite like that. It's still very much an iPad and it has some heft to it still. But it is lighter and it is thinner, definitely. And it is amazing to think that you can have such a bright OLED screen, and such a vivid kind of versatile device with such thinness, really. I use the Magic Keyboard now, so that's pretty much doubled the thickness. So it's not quite that fragile feeling anymore. But I do like the finish on the side of the Magic Keyboard. It has the same kind of aluminum sort of edge to it. So it kind of matches and it feels much more like a laptop than it ever did. So which is pretty cool. I mean, these are not necessarily things that are essential for creative stuff, but it's nice, it feels nice. It's a nice little extra and bit of quality there to the device, I think.
Awesome. But hopefully that's going to be really fun to use and you'll see the differences in like performance and stuff like that. I think then we can then move on to what is going to be our main subject for today's episode, which is a question that we get asked quite a lot as sort of creators, and it's, how do I find my art style? It's a question we get asked a lot, and there are a lot of things that play a part in finding your art style. And I think it'll be really interesting for us to try and maybe explain a little bit of how you yourself found your own style, which obviously we covered quite a lot in the previous episode, but in general for how that practice worked, but also just general advice to a lot of our audience who are in the Procreate space, because a lot of our audience, I think, fall into two categories, and by all means sort of argue that against me where necessary, but is that I think our audience falls into two categories of, there's the casuals who want to just participate in our weekly tutorials and are happy and just enjoy that process, and I've got to say it straight off the bat, that is perfectly fine. I think a lot of people overthink these kind of things, and if you are someone who just simply enjoys a tutorial once a week, well, another creator as well on the side as well, so a couple of tutorials a week, and that's what you enjoy and that's your escape from day to day, and that's where you get your enjoyment, there is absolutely nothing wrong with you never need to move beyond that.
No,
that is your form of entertainment, that is your form of enjoyment, and that's perfectly normal to do so. But I would say a small percentage of our audience then propose the question of, how do I find my art style? They're the ones that want to branch out from our tutorials and want to create some original work, or have maybe been inspired by our own styles, that then they want to go off and do more of that, but on their own and independently in a sense, but to put then their own twist on it, which I think is where we're probably going to end up aiming a lot of this sort of advice to, because finding your style, again, there are multiple layers to it, and that's something we will break down, I think, throughout this. I'm going to get started with the first sort of point that I've got written down here, which is experiment with different tools and techniques. So using a lot of different brushes. finding different brushes then with different textures that are integrated in the grain section of the brush studio. That's probably something that is quite overlooked, is actually finding a brush set that matches your aesthetic. And that what you really like the look of. I've got, for example, a couple of different styles of the Nico Rull and the dry ink. Those two for me work very well together and partner beautifully. But then you might have something like just the monoline brush and the soft airbrush potentially to add color and gradient, etc. Is that something you agree with in terms of the brushes are quite key in finding that kind of aesthetic that you like first of all?
I think it can be, certainly. I think if you've already identified that your aesthetic or things that you're drawn to are maybe representative sort of images of landscapes or of different subject matter that's recognizable, and then it's the way that it's done that is the interesting part. So that, if it's a very textural looking kind of watercolor style, or whether it's just something that looks really quite sketchy, and you really see the brush textures at the end of the process, then that can be something, if you've found inspiring in a different artist, or you've seen work out there, maybe you don't even know who the artist is, but if you've seen that, that might have inspired you to want to pursue that. And in which case, then yeah, sure, I think that experimenting with the different brush types within Procreate is a really good thing to do. Now, I was a little bit probably slow to do that initially. I've explained previously that I favoured the soft airbrush with an airbrushing, which is about the most boring brush you can probably find within Procreate in many ways. But my style was about just smoothing over that look, so you couldn't really identify any individual brush marks. That wasn't really the aesthetic that I was looking for at the time. Being a fan of more of actually traditional airbrushing techniques, I really like those smooth transitions, that brushless kind of look, and so I instantly was gravitating towards that. Now I've tried to expand that in the tutorials and add different textures, and mainly as a way of finding quicker ways to do things, because one of the disadvantages of using the soft brush with an airbrushing is that you have to do every single point, every single mark on the canvas manually, and there's no ability to create sort of scatters of textures and create foliage or grass or any other things other than doing it all completely manually. So I think that it is pretty important, if you're going to do digital work, certainly, to really dig through those brushes, and not just the brushes but the settings within each of the brushes too, because I personally change the spacing of brushes quite a lot. So there might be a texture that is very clumped together naturally in the default version within Procreate, but just changing the spacing changes the little granular parts of that brush, and then it can just take on a life quite different really than the kind of official Procreate version.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of open the box a little bit and expand beyond, I know I mentioned about Procreate sort of in that initial intro. The same rules apply to traditional art. If you are a painter, you're looking for potentially, the type of paint that you enjoy painting with, like you said, maybe watercolor or oil paint, etc. But not only that, what brushes do you really like? Physical brushes do you enjoy? The texture that is created beyond the paint. And again, I want to try and talk to our audience, but I also want to maybe talk to a large audience that potentially this applies to any form of art. Obviously, most of our audience will be Procreate based. I think once you find the style, the visual style that you like the look of, for me, I think that the next step, and sometimes they're parallel and sometimes one comes before the other, is finding what you enjoy creating. What do you enjoy creating and designing and painting, etc.? And then the two need to be combined together. Finding something that you really enjoy painting, that you get a lot of love out of. That's the thing. And they say it all the time, is like, you should always draw and paint stuff that you enjoy, because that will spur you on to do more of it, which is a later point that we'll get to. But I definitely I think style comes before object potentially, but they don't need to go in any particular order. Is that something that you think you also agree with, is that the subject matter is really key?
I think that my early experiences of studying different objects or different types of subjects has informed the kind of things that I gravitate towards. I've always enjoyed drawing natural forms, for example, so drawing trees, drawing sort of twisted branches, or drawing at school even, or at college. I was drawing the kind of the model skeleton, and I really excuse me, I really enjoyed some of those shapes. And I think that that has informed some of the future things that I do. Now, when it comes to the Procreate tutorials, they're more traditional landscapes. Um, but even then, they dictate the kind of the shapes that you create, because you can ask one person to create some rock textures and ask another person to create some rock textures, and just the quality of those shapes can be quite drastically different depending on what experience you have of different subject matter, I think. So I guess my first thought on that is to find things that you enjoy drawing, or painting. And it doesn't have to be a landscape. It could be shells, it could be skeletons, it could be leaves, it could be faces, it could be whatever it is that you just feel drawn to. I think just doing lots of that will give you a language of shapes and forms and gestures that could be really useful in itself.
And I think that leads nicely into what I'm sort of referring to as step 2, really. So the first stage is sort of the design elements of it, subject and aesthetic. But stage 2 for me very much is the study and analysis of other artists. Like you said there about the study of shapes, there are so many amazing digital artists and traditional artists that can make a bush look a certain way, but is completely different to the next person in line who would draw that bush. And like you just said there, someone will draw a rock very differently. The textures on a rock, are they smooth paint strokes that just have a slight texture to them, or are they scattered on, are they dashed on, are they, it's very much the technique of also your application of the color onto the canvas. And I think for me, if you can study, then some of your favorite artists, take a look at how they break stuff down. I mean, your techniques, for example, just like you say, the soft airbrush, that's a study in its own of understanding how to layer color. Then what comes first. Step back from the tutorial first and see, if we're going to then paint this certain element of the design, what stages are we going through? It's solid shape maybe first, the base shape, as I call it in my tutorials, followed by, is it shadows next? Okay, cool. We build the shadows because we can then lay a highlight on top. And then again, what shapes are being used in those sort of styles of that artist don't change just because the other artist uses the soft airbrush or whatever brush it may be. Remember what you're still doing at the beginning. Remember your style, the brushes that you want to use, the ones that give you the most joy and you love the aesthetic of. But I urge people sometimes, my thought process here is that they could follow any one of our tutorials, but just use the brushes that they set out as sort of the ones that they enjoy. Follow a James Julier tutorial, a JoelCreate tutorial, but use your brushes. Use the palette, but use your brushes to see if it leans towards that style as you maybe anticipated. If you were to use a painting brush, for example, for some of the work you do, you get a very different visual style to some of those mountain designs or landscapes. And I think that's where they can start to see their style start to evolve with a little bit of tutoring at the same time, and also a goal. Sometimes it can be really hard to go, okay, I've got my style now and I've got my subject. Now what? Like, where do I? What am I aiming to do? What's the? Whereas a tutorial can at least give you an end point, just a mini sort of target, almost a task for you to express your style with. So I would, definitely say like stage 2 would very much be study and analyzing, because obviously you mentioned in a previous episode about someone who inspired you with the soft airbrush. I can't remember his name at the minute, but
HR Giga.
So obviously you said, I think you said in there, taking a look at their style and how they go about, hiding lines that you mentioned that he does. And obviously that then translates into the work that you now do and also pass on to other people.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's an argument almost to be made. I was listening to what you were saying and also thinking about the counter side of that, in that I think sometimes it's as well to give the task, or put the task of a final image in mind to one side sometimes too. For me personally, I found that just doodling and not knowing where I was going with the shapes and textures was a good way to just play. Just like, you would literally as a child go to the sandbox and you would have a material and you were just experimenting to see what the limitations of it were, or what you could build and what was possible. And I think that to have a blank page, a sketchbook, a blank digital canvas, whatever, and a tool that you determined to have a go at using, I think just to see what you can create just by doodling without even an end product in mind is quite useful. When I filled, I was at a point at university where I knew I wanted to just explore visual language, but I didn't know what I wanted to draw. And I found that just by testing out shapes and forms and just sort of morphing them here and tweaking them there and just creating things that didn't exist, just because I liked the look of them, it really gave me an idea of the subject matter that I actually liked to look at too, because inevitably I would draw things that look like trees or look like skeletons, and then I ended up thinking, well, that's my style in a sense, and that's the things I'm interested in now, because they just sort of sprung forward from our subconscious. Given the infinite possibility of things that I could draw with that blank canvas, I ended up doing that. And it could be partially because they're the things you've looked at, and therefore you just kind of regurgitate on the canvas things that are already in your mind. But I think it's a useful exercise to just see what happens on the page. And it might be a load of lines and squiggles and abstracts, and it doesn't look like anything you want to show people. But I think you learn doing that. And if you make that a regular practice, I think that you can learn quite a lot about your interest in shapes and forms and colours and textures. And those things can then be applied to any subject matter. And you can, it's almost like you look at a landscape or a scene done by Van Gogh is going to be, vivid colours and really strong textures on it. And not just because of the paint, because if you see his pencil studies too, there was a certain quality, a really strong line to it. And I think that kind of style only comes through experience, really, of really just doing it on a daily basis, regardless of whether you know what you're going to draw at the start.
And I think you've perfectly led then into step 3, which is create consistently, because your style that you start with or you think you want to go down, it will change. It will change, and you will do things that you enjoy. And you will also get to the point where the regularity of drawing will become second nature. I can see when you said there about kind of like a doodle book of like, if you like it and enjoy doing landscapes, let's just stick to something we know and love, like a rock or a boulder. I can see if you create a Procreate canvas with enough space for like 3x4 or something like that, and just draw a rock, every day. There was a PewDiePie put up a video, I think it was like a month ago, where he wanted to learn to draw. And he was drawing anime characters, just like sort of headshots, sort of chest and above, really. But you saw he was drawing every day. He was drawing maybe 4 or 5, and some of them he said, he didn't like, and he really hated them at the beginning. But by like day 30 of just drawing another face again, and doing something slightly different, there were so many days in his journey where he would say, I'm going to draw this particular character today instead of the sort of anime girls that he was drawing before, and changing that and learning how to do something slightly different. If you're going to draw a rock, maybe try and just do 4 or 5 or something like that. And then the next day, maybe a rock formation, evolve it in some way. How can you add, or maybe it's just a boulder, but you're embedding it in a lawn of grass, around it, and then add flowers or other elements around it, so that every day you're adding something. But there will be things and techniques that you pick up along that journey of drawing regularly that will give you the shortcuts to your success and your style that you enjoy. You'll learn, that's okay, I'm happy to do a block of color for like a row of grass that sits in front of my boulder now, and then just do a couple of pen strokes with green, enough to give the top impression of the grass, but the bottom is just filled in with solid color. It's something I'm actually leaning towards a little bit more recently, is given the interpretation of something, but not having to draw absolutely every single element of it. Yeah. There was a tutorial I saw you do, for example. It was a very dense blue forest. It was fairly recently, and the way you layered the color from back to front, but you did the trees. You didn't draw absolutely every single leaf that was in those trees. You did enough on each layer to give the full interpretation and the volume of the forest without having to do every single one. And that's something that I think a lot of people eventually click onto, that I don't have to sit here and draw an entire meadow. I can block it in, and as detail gets further away, I don't need to draw that detail. It's miles away. No one can tell a blade of grass. We're not taking a photograph. This is an artistic interpretation, and
that's
take the liberties that you want.
Time. That took me a long time to find the confidence to be quite rough and gestural, really, and just imply things. And certainly all my earlier drawings, until I was at least a late teenager and beyond, were very much meticulously drawing every single detail that was observable, which can be an important practice too. I think that being as accurate as you possibly can is a good exercise. But like you say, finding bold ways of kind of expressing a point is something that can come later on. But it's a tough one to start with, I think. I think that can only come through just practicing with the different textures and shapes, and it will come with time, but it's not going to be an instant thing. And I remember my experience as a high school teacher, going back to what you were saying in terms of like drawing the same thing on a daily basis, or just trying to come up with better versions of the same thing, really. I remember that many a time that a student would come to me with a drawing of a tree or a concept they'd come up with, and that would be it. They'd stick to their first one, and they were incapable of imagining that they could come up with a second version or a third version or a reiteration of it that could add something different to it. They kind of stuck with the very first version that they were capable of. And the first version, even if it's successful, is rarely the best that you can do. And I think that by digging deeper and having that repetition of, going back to a subject matter and just digging a little bit deeper is really useful exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. And along that journey, which for me is step 4 really of this kind of 5 sort of pointers, 4, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes, but embrace those mistakes. Sometimes there is a mistake is something that you didn't plan on doing. And sometimes, as Bob Ross used to say, you can have happy little accidents. And you'll think of you'll somehow apply a color or something or a smudge or something you didn't know you were going to do. But sometimes it's the way forward. It's something that took you beyond the sort of norm of your process that you then look at and go, I actually really like. I've done that so many times where I've added something else to a design just by just messing around, doodling, like as you said, chucking in a piece of color or a brush or a smudge or something like that. And now I think I'm doing that every time. And so when I go back to that kind of drawing the boulder situation, over like a month or something, you'll do something different that you go, no, that's now part of the practice. That I actually really enjoy that. And it's the mistakes that you should embrace along the way that can ultimately push your style a little bit further and develop it in a way that you did not ever see coming.
It's interesting. I remember it just brought to mind a quote that I read somewhere. Not that you can always believe these quotes, but a quote supposedly from Picasso that said that he was very wary or mistrustful of happy accidents. And I've definitely fallen, victim of having a happy accident, and more in the traditional realm where things can accidentally go in a certain direction with traditional materials. Less so in digital, I found, but in traditional materials, you might just happen across something that looks really cool and you didn't intend it, and it's just there, and you kind of preserve it like some precious thing you've found rather than created. Apparently his attitude was that he'd immediately destroy it, and then only if he could recreate it a second time would it stand and be genuinely his. We could claim it then as a genuine production of his, which is an interesting concept. I'm not quite that ruthless. I can't say I've destroyed things that I find in my artwork that work well. I tend to sort of be a bit more precious about them and ring fence them and study them and see if I can recreate them on a future piece, like you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think rolling into sort of the final point would just be, I've got it titled here as combine and be authentic. Draw inspiration from various sources and also different. So try to sort of, again, when we went back earlier to say about sort of different inspiration from different digital artists, try and don't stop learning is what I'm trying to also say. Like, don't stop learning. That you can always learn something new. There's always something that a tutor or a tutorial or someone in just an Instagram post is doing slightly differently that you haven't yet seen. But again, be authentic to yourself and apply that in your style as you are developing it. There's so much that I continuously learn in Procreate all the time, just small techniques here and there. And like I said, my biggest, and which we've both sort of mentioned, is letting go of that kind of detail in the distance and being more ruthless with letting go of it and giving the interpretation. But those are things that you very much learn over time. So don't stop learning. If you get to a point where you're still creating authentic art, or you're creating your own authentic art, I can guarantee if you haven't done a tutorial for a while and you step into one, there may be some work or a method to doing something that you then see. I mean, there's also courses, obviously. I speak a lot in a sense of talking to our audience, which is YouTube based. There's tons of courses out there where someone will guide you from start to finish. And I mentioned about sort of different sources. I will sit and watch a Photoshop tutorial of talking about the creation of landscapes because the primary sort of principles of them still pass over into Procreate.
Of course,
and when I see these artists sort of apply their brush strokes and color, I know what brushes I can use now because, again, I've isolated those brushes that I think I really enjoy using. And I can go, okay, cool, I can replicate that, but with this brush in Procreate, and it fit my style, but I learned that from their processes.
I think that's a really important point. If you never stop learning, I mean, people may watch our channels and think that we've got it cracked and we've figured out how to do things, and that isn't the case. It isn't that we've learned how to do everything and we're just passing down our knowledge. That's not really how it works. I think that we're on a journey with our viewers, and every time we create a piece, we're finding new ways ourselves that we can actually express that and execute that. And it is a learning curve, even as the teacher. In some ways, you have to, learn in order to be able to teach it, and you learn the most when you're trying to teach it. So I've found that doing these tutorials has really assisted my knowledge, and it's been really, really useful in that sense. You may hear my dogs in the background. If you do, I apologise. I have two little dogs that are very noisy, but there you
go. I think the other thing, sort of, again, to speak directly to our audiences, a lot of, I mean, James, you're quite heavily sort of niched into landscapes. I tend to sort of tread a little bit more into variety, but there are other tutors, and this is by no way sort of a shot or anything like that. But what I'm getting at is a lot of tutors provide variety. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, is you kind of have to step away from that a little bit and find the thing. I'm trying to reiterate my most important point, really, is trying to find the thing that you most enjoy drawing. And sometimes that is not the variety of content that we get from tutorials that come out, every week sort of thing. Finding maybe tutors that fit the object or the concept that you like creating and following them solely potentially down that road, and maybe try and find other artists that also create that content again in non-digital art, maybe outside of Procreate. They might be a fresco artist, they might be a just a Photoshop artist. There's always someone that has a similar kind of vibe to you, but you just got to try and step out of the Procreate space a little bit and try and source that kind of inspiration, really. Do you think you have any more sort of individual points that you think more so in your journey as well, like any sort of particular points that you think was quite inspirational that sort of set you down the path that you're on?
I think that it is being willing to explore and try and find new territory. And it is useful to look at other artists' work and find the inspiration from other artists, certainly. And that teaches you about what you like and what you don't. And it can set your imagination off to think about the kind of places that you could go creatively. But then it's really important to find the territory that is just yours. And it might be just that you're fixated on a certain type of color scheme or textures or subject matter. And I think that whatever is special to you is going to translate into something that perhaps other people haven't seen before. And there's always a temptation to chase what you think other people will like. And that's certainly the danger for us as content creators, certainly, is that we're trying to think what will do well, because it becomes a job for us too, but at the same time juggle with that what we actually genuinely find interesting, and isn't just for the benefit of other people. So yeah, it's a juggling act between finding something, if you're going to show it to other people, that you think might appeal. But I tend to prefer just to find things that inspire me. I think probably personally that's been more important in my journey, whether that's in my case skeletons and things that people might think is strange to study or not beautiful, but I find fascination, or I find all sorts of things fascinating that other people perhaps don't. And I wouldn't shy away from whatever it is that you find interesting and just pursue that. And that's going to be the thing that sets you apart and creates a unique voice, I think, more than anything else.
Yep, I could not agree more. Don't do it for the social likes. Don't do it for the comments. Don't do it for anything like that. Don't. If that's your goal, it's the wrong route, I'm afraid. That's the route that's going to you're going to try and appeal. As your audience grows larger, you're going to slowly not be able to appeal to all those people that you brought in, because you're trying to accommodate for 100 people, or say 10 people at the beginning, 100, 1,000, 10, and so on. You're never going to be able to appeal to people, and that will drive you mad. But if you're drawing something that you enjoy, that it will get likes, it will resonate with people. That's the wonderful things at the minute with sort of all these algorithms of like home screens. It will try and put your content in front of people and you will find people, but be authentic to yourself and make sure you're not just chasing the likes. And I think that's a really good way of sort of wrapping up this sort of this topic today, of finding your own style. And you're on your own road, you're on your own journey, and also I think it's also, to sort of give one extra point there, comparison is the thief of joy, as they say. Don't look at artists, if you're just starting, don't look at artists that have been doing this for 20 years, 10 years, or went to uni and did a certain degree that fits that style that you really like. You're starting your journey where you are, but if you start today, in 2 weeks from now, you're 2 weeks ahead of the next guy starting, and they will potentially look at your work and be inspired, even if you're just 2 weeks ahead. But don't compare yourself to the people that have been doing this for a long, long, long time. I think it's very important. We always say that our tutorials, I make mistakes in tutorials. They get cut. You don't see the mistakes. I will do a mountain and go, that looks rubbish. And I'll tell myself in the edit, Joel, we're doing it again, and I cut back and I'll do it again.
I've scrapped whole tutorials on the basis of that. There's some tutorials people will never see,
Exactly, and we both have a few of them. So then, we make mistakes. The professionals still make mistakes, and that's fine. And I think there's also a lot of the internet these days is very much super polished, and that's not the reality, I'm afraid. And also, those people have been doing it a lot longer. So take joy in your own work, be authentic to yourself, and that's sort of our 5 points on finding your own style.
You don't have to be good at everything either, do you? You could find what it is that you like to do and become the best at that. And it could be a very niche area that, you just find a really fascinating thing. You don't have to be great at everything. I don't tend to like to do figurative. I don't do portraits, and I don't do faces and animals. That's not a strength of mine, so I stay clear of that, and I just focus on the things I enjoy and become good at that. So you don't have to be good at everything.
Bingo. Absolutely. Guys, if you've enjoyed this episode of the Sketchwave, make sure to subscribe to the channel. New episodes are released every Tuesday. You can also find links to our socials in the description down below. And if you've got a question that you would like us to answer on the show, there's also a form in the description down below where you can submit a question for us to potentially answer on the show. Again, make sure to follow us on the socials where we'll be posting clips of our episodes. James, thank you so much for today's episode and all your insight and advice. It's been a pleasure as always. And guys, we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.
See you later. Bye-bye.